Despite our debate being about direct doxastic voluntarism and its relation to Christianity, Dante Ting thought it would be a good idea to spam my topic with the Kalam cosmological argument. I of course pointed out to Dante that this argument is not meant to prove the Christian God. In response, he claims that there are deductive arguments specifically for Christianity which are equally if not more compelling than the Kalam. I have no idea which arguments he is referring to. You would think that Christianity would be harder to prove than theism, since it is a more specific claim. I would be very interested to hear these deductive arguments for Christianity, but unfortunately Dante didn't even name any of them. So for this video, I'll have to stick with the Kalam. While it is irrelevant to the topic of our debate, I want to address it anyway so I have something to fall back on in case he spams this thing somewhere else. Contrary to Dante's claim, science does not provide us with any principles to describe causality in the absence of a universe. There is no contradiction in believing the universe was uncaused, and the proposal of causation without time or physical substance is not somehow more scientific. My first question to Dante is, why does the cause have to be personal? What exactly is it that makes a personal cause logically necessary or more probable? Craig uses the following argument against a mechanistic cause. If the unchanging cause is sufficient for the effect, then the cause should not exist without the effect. This is problematic because it indicates that the universe should be eternal, but according to premise 2, the universe began to exist. In order to escape this problem, Craig infers agent causation. However, Craig concedes that an indeterministic impersonal cause is logically possible, although he considers this an appeal to an unknown entity. In this video, I'll attempt to show that God is just as much of an unknown entity as an impersonal cause. This is because the concept of God relies on two unwarranted assumptions: mind-body dualism and libertarian free will. Neither of these is known to be true for any being. So, as Craig makes the move from an impersonal cause to a personal one, all he does is add unfounded claims. In this screen capture, I asked Dante how God, a changeless being, was able to change. Dante doesn't seem to understand the question, and he simply suggests an unclear use of the word changeless. Had he actually read what Craig has written about this, he would see that my question is not inconsistent with Craig's position. According to Craig, there must be an exercise of God's causal power in order for the universe to be created. That entails, of course, an intrinsic change on God's part, which brings him into time at the moment of creation. So Craig's answer is that in order to make any change, God ceases to be timeless. God's will is what allows him to become temporal. My problem is that if God can change at will, in what sense is he changeless? The change from being timeless to temporal is a change in itself, and God would already have to be temporal in order to make this change in time. It therefore logically follows that he makes this change while being timeless and changeless. I think it is now abundantly clear that Dante has no idea what he's talking about. The moment he stops quoting Craig, he gets everything wrong. Craig's proposed cause is a free agent, so obviously free will must be true in order for this solution to work. This of course means that Craig has to provide an argument for libertarian free will. He cannot just assume that such a controversial position is true. Let me read you Dante's response. Which part of only a libertarian agent could interrupt the static reign of being of the first cause sans the universe, do you not understand? God having libertarian free will has nothing to do with the topic. Tell me again why the argument requires me to prove libertarian free will. So, why does the argument require him to prove free will? Because free will is assumed in the quote he just posted. Without it, the argument fails. This is yet another example of Dante failing to understand the argument he is using, despite the relevant quotes being right in front of him. Dante seems to think that the arguments against free will only apply to people and not God. This is false. One of the most common objections to libertarian free will is that it's an incoherent proposition. Unless it can be shown to be coherent, it can't be said that any being has free will.
And it's worse than an illusion. It's actually a totally incoherent idea. which is to say it's impossible to describe a universe in which it could be true. Not only is it untrue, it's hard to make sense of what's even being claimed to be true. So our choices matter, and there are clearly paths toward making wiser ones. I mean, there's no telling how much a conversation with a smart person could change you. But we can't choose what we choose in life. And when it seems that we choose what we choose, so perhaps when going back and forth between two options, we don't choose to choose what we choose. I mean, there is a regress here that ends in darkness. We have to take a first step, or a last one, for reasons that are subjectively mysterious.
In order to defend dualism, Dante links me to an article on reasonable faith. I appreciate him doing this because it prevents him from misrepresenting his own position. I've provided screenshots of the article, which I'm going to refute point by point. Neuroscience isn't brought into this discussion to argue that it completely disproves dualism. The point is that it offers a reasonable alternative to an unnecessary supernatural claim. The idea of a non-physical entity interacting with the brain is scientifically unfalsifiable. That's because dualism does not necessarily make any clear, testable predictions. The existence of a disembodied mind may well be indistinguishable from the absence of one. That is to say that no matter how much is explained by neuroscience, we will never be able to conclusively say that there is not an immaterial component. The whole concept of something being supernatural usually involves it being unable to be confirmed or disproven through naturalistic means. However, I highly doubt that dualists originally expected so much to be explained by neuroscience. At this time, no sensible person would engage in the hopeless search of the human brain for some kind of conduit to the supernatural realm. The unfalsifiability of dualism through science should not be seen as any kind of support, but rather a concession that dualism is disconnected from empirical study. This part just presupposes everything it is meant to argue for. First of all, I don't think the distinction between mind and body is necessary unless it is already being assumed that the mind is outside of the body rather than being a part of it. And he can't argue that the movement of his fingers is ultimately produced by mental events unless he denies the causal chain preceding them.
The first problem is that we live in a world of cause and effect. And there's no way of thinking about cause and effect that allows us to say that the buck stops here. The buck never stops.
Further, this notion of mental to physical causation assumes that the mind is non-physical. So rather than argue for dualism, he has simply asserted it. I don't find this the least bit persuasive. Name-dropping neuroscientists is not a substitute for an argument. Why not just quote the peer-reviewed studies which provide evidence for dualism? Of course, the answer is because there aren't any, and there probably won't be any, because dualism is hardly a testable claim. That's why the status of neuroscientist is irrelevant in this discussion. This is of course granting that there is anything more than a small minority of neuroscientists who accept dualism. Here he argues that an event is not identical to its causal antecedents. This is true only in the most insignificant way. I suppose one could argue that a TV turning off is not identical to someone pressing the off button beforehand, but rather it results from this. But notice that this can be said of any causal relationship. The problem is that he has conceded the causal dependency of psychological events on brain events. Yet he goes on to say that the two are simply correlated. There is an obvious conflict between these two statements. And this last bit isn't even an argument, so I'm not going to comment on it. This article was supposed to defend dualism against the objection that neuroscience indicates our minds are identical to our brains. This is not my objection to dualism. I don't think dualism is impossible, but the idea that the mind is physical could actually be proven wrong, and is held up to scrutiny. So how is dualism the better explanation? It appears to be no more evident than intelligent falling or Russell's teapot. Before I conclude, I have one more thing to address. This is a video that Dante sent me, in which William Lane Craig argues for free will and mind-body dualism.
Okay, this is a great question. What our questioner here points out is that in most philosophy departments, people are determinists, and they think that we have freedom only in the sense that you voluntarily do what you're determined to do in many cases. But it's not as though you have what's called libertarian freedom to act differently than the way you in fact do act. Now, I think that the reason for the dominance of determinism is physicalism or materialism.
Now, it's also important to recognize that the case I'm building against free will does not depend upon philosophical materialism, the idea that reality is at bottom physical. Now, there are very good reasons to believe that the mind is at bottom physical. Certainly most mental events are the product of physical events. I mean, the brain is a physical system, entirely beholden to the laws of nature. But even if we have souls, even if the human mind were made of soul stuff that we don't understand, nothing about my argument would change. The unconscious operations of a soul grant you no more freedom than the unconscious neurophysiology of your brain does. If you don't know what your soul is going to do next, you're not in control of your soul. This is obviously true where people behave in ways that they wish they wouldn't. You know, so you think of all the committed Christians whose souls just happen to be gay. So that's obviously not an argument for free will, but it's also true when you do exactly what you wish you had done in retrospect. The soul that allows you to stay on your diet is just as mysterious as the soul that tempts you to eat a hot fudge sundae.
They are determinists because they're physicalists. They don't believe that there is a mind or soul distinct from the body. And I would agree with them on that. I think if you are not a dualist with regard to mind and body, then you are going to be stuck with determinism. But determinism flies in the face, I think, of our experience.
You know, I'm about to argue that free will doesn't even correspond to any subjective fact about us. And if you pay attention to your experience closely, you can notice this. If you pay attention, you can see that you no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say. Thoughts simply appear in consciousness. Very much like my words. What are you going to think next? What am I going to say next? I could suddenly start talking about the pleasures of snowshoeing. You know, where did that come from? From your point of view, it came out of nowhere. But the same thing is happening in the privacy of your own mind. You've all made an effort to be here and to stay this extra hour to hear, presumably to hear what I have to say about free will. But there's also a voice in your head that is just saying things. Haven't you noticed? And many of these things have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. You're struggling to follow my train of thought, but there's competition. You suddenly start thinking things like, I should probably stop drinking diet soda. Thoughts just emerge in consciousness. We are not authoring them. That would require that we think them before we think them. If you can't control your next thought, and you don't know what it's going to be until it arises, where is your freedom of will? Now, at this moment, many of you are thinking, what the hell is he talking about? Here's what I'm talking about. You didn't pick that thought either.
As human beings, where we do experience ourselves as free agents, and I think the determinism is even perhaps rationally unaffirmable, because to affirm determinism, you have to admit that you're just determined to believe in it. That you haven't done so by freely weighing the arguments for and against. It's just like growing or having a toothache. that you came to believe in determinism. So I think there are real problems with determinism, and especially with physicalism. And the argument that I gave about states of intentionality, I think would probably be one of the most powerful reasons to be a dualist. Right. If you are a physicalist, then I think, as Alex Rosenberg rightly sees, you can't really say that we have thoughts about anything, because brain states are not about things. Physical objects aren't about things. There is no intentionality. So that would mean there is no intentionality, therefore there is no meaning to sentences, therefore there is no truth, because they're all meaningless, and you get yourself into a self-referentially incoherent bog as a result of denying that there is a real self, a real mental subject distinct from the body. So while this isn't my area of expertise, I'm persuaded by the arguments of people like my colleague J.P. Moreland that as human persons, we are not just electrochemical machines. We are selves, we are souls, we are minds who are intimately connected with this physical body.
Alex Rosenberg is a reductive physicalist. So even if we grant Craig's refutation of Rosenberg's position, it would only prove that reductive physicalism is untrue. This gets him nowhere closer to disproving the various conceptions of emergent materialism, and it certainly doesn't allow him to proclaim that substance dualism is true. As for Craig's claim that determinism is rationally unaffirmable, I prefer to object to this on the grounds that it does not have any bearing on the truth of determinism. Even if we allow Craig's scenario in which our arguments for determinism aren't rationally formed, determinism would still be true, because it is the basis for Craig's claim that our arguments aren't rationally formed. The standard response to this is that it's a non sequitur, because it does not follow from determinism that we are incapable of rational thought. While we may be just as deterministic as a rock slide, this does not imply that we are rationally equivalent to one. This concludes my examination of the logical arguments Dante has provided for mind-body dualism and free will. Without either of these propositions, Craig's argument collapses under the burden of baseless assumptions. Let's review the reasoning which leads Craig to a personal cause. Remember that it must be uncaused, beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful, and indeterministic. According to Craig, a person is the only entity which fits this description perfectly. However, it has not been shown how a single one of these attributes is applicable to a person. Craig seeks to get around this by positing an unembodied mind, but as I have argued, this is yet another unfounded claim. This leaves us with no reason to infer a personal cause over a mechanistic cause, as both would have to be defined as unknown entities.